Hello and welcome into another episode of Dusty's Corner with your host, Dusty. That's me. Alright, so the NFL offseason is one of the worst times of the year. It's boring, there's not much news. You're just looking at all the NFL socials, just hoping that maybe you get some interesting insight out of training camp. And there's not really much else to fill the void. And some people are just looking forward to preseason, but we all know preseason's a bit of a joke. But I've found that one of the really interesting shows that's out there right now, kind of giving me more insight to the NFL, is the Netflix documentary Receiver that was just released last week as of the recording of this video. And this is a direct sequel to the quarterback series that came out the previous year. And I think it was kind of interesting that they didn't just do another season of quarterback. They actually have an introduction with Randy Moss in the beginning where they're kind of talking about their philosophy as to why they did that. And I think it makes a lot of sense. Of course, quarterback is the most popular position in the league, but you don't really see a lot of the more finer intricacies of other skill positions. And you look at the NFL as a passing league, and who's on the receiving end of most of quarterbacks' passes? The wide receivers. And so I think that that was a really good place for them to go with this series, because if they kept a quarterback, it might have gotten a little stale. Like, you already had a full season of that. Do you really just want to see another full season of that, just with different players? I think this changes it up a bit, because you bring a different perspective to the game. And I think that's really a lot of what I'm getting out of this. So as of this recording, I have watched the first half of the season. So we'll be making two parts to this video. This is part one, where I'll be talking about my observations from the first 4 episodes. And just as kind of a recap, it's following George Kittle, Deebo Samuel, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Devontae Adams, and Justin Jefferson. And I think it's a really interesting spread of receivers and teams that they chose, because all of those receivers, they're really good receivers, but are they all on really good teams? The 49ers and the Lions, yes. The 49ers, an established contender. The Lions, one of the hot up-and-coming teams. The Vikings, one of those teams that are always kind of in the mix, but they never really seem to live up to their potential, but they have a lot of talent. And the Raiders, who are just kind of there. They are kind of average, maybe a little bit below average. But yeah, I think it was an interesting spread, and you get to see a lot of the insights of the struggles that the players go through based on their individual situations throughout the series. So the first takeaway I have from this show is the production quality is really, really high, and that was the case with the quarterback series as well. You get a lot of insight into what's going on the field. There's just a lot of really cool footage. They mic up the players. You get to hear what they're saying. You get kind of like their mental state in the game. And I was noticing throughout this that there was a lot of stuff where it's like, oh, I kind of noticed that happened on one of the NFL Sundays. But then this really jogged my memory and gave me a lot more context as to what was going on in some of those situations. Like, for example, they were talking about George Kittle playing against the Dallas Cowboys, and I didn't realize it was his birthday, and then he ended up having like a 3-touchdown performance, and it's really cool because watching that, you're like, and not really knowing kind of like their family dynamics in the background and like the team dynamics, you're kind of just like, oh, George Kittle went off today. He got me 3 touchdowns. I had a great fantasy performance from him. But there's a lot more to it than that, because they actually, his family like threw a big party for him. They had a bunch of people there, and they got to witness him have a huge game on his birthday, which was just kind of cool. And then afterwards, his family actually invited teammates over to George Kittle's house, and they had like an after party there too. So it's just kind of cool because you don't always see the interconnectedness and the chemistry off the field with some of the players when you're just watching a standard game on Sunday. So I found that really interesting. Another part of seeing these clips was in hearing their dialogue, you were able to get a lot more context into certain plays, and I really noticed this with they had a clip about the pregame altercation between the Browns and the 49ers. And Deebo Samuel was actually the one who started that. And there was a big scuffle. The refs broke it up. But what I thought was most interesting was afterwards, after it was all broken up, you could see the ref talking. Like, I believe it was the head ref for that game. He was talking to Deebo Samuel, and he was kind of setting, like, his parameters. It's like, hey, we know that you're a good guy in the league. You're well respected, but you got to kind of tone that down, and we're going to be watching that throughout the game. And I thought that that was really interesting because you could see the effort that even the refs are putting in. And I know we all like to bash on the refs, but their job is really difficult, and they're trying to manage all of these like huge NFL athletes, all these big personalities, and yeah, they gotta set down the ground rules like that. And I think that there's a lot that goes into that we definitely don't see on Football Sunday, and this kind of lent a little focus into that, gave them a little spotlight, so I really appreciated that. So there's a lot of cool things throughout the first 4 episodes akin to that I saw that gave me a lot more knowledge into what the context around a lot of the plays were, a lot of certain team dynamics and whatnot. So I thought that was really insightful. The second thing I garnered from this is that wide receivers are so hurt all the time, and you really don't notice this. It's like you'll look at I know for me personally, it's like you kind of just assume it's like, oh yeah, NFL players, they're tough, they play through pain sort of thing. You don't realize the extent of the pain they're in. Like, you and me, we wouldn't be playing in those games. Well, first of all, we wouldn't be playing in those games, period. But if we had any of those injuries, we would not be playing in these games. Because even just Amon-Ra St. Brown, like the first game he injures his foot, he has to have like steel plates in his shoes just to like make it so he doesn't put too much pressure on his foot. And then on top of that, like the next game, he like hurts his oblique muscle, and it's like he's in a ton of pain with that. And then even further down the line, you've got he gets like hand, foot, and mouth disease, and I had no idea that he had that when I was watching that game between the Lions and the Raiders. And you hear him talking on the sideline and just how much pain he's in, and the ability for him to perform at such a high level, even feeling like that terrible, it just speaks measures to how tough these guys are. And I think it particularly interesting with Amon-Ra St. Brown, I really gained a better appreciation for just how tough he is, because he was talking about his training routine growing up. And he said that as he was like playing football as a kid, his dad was coaching, they were noticing one of the other guys had really good hands as a wide receiver. And his dad went over to the other coach and was like, hey, he's really good. How does he have such good hands? And he's like, yeah, we do the ball machine and we catch 200 passes a day. And Amon-Ra's dad goes over to Amon-Ra and says, okay, we got to be better. We're doing 205. And that's just the mentality that was in his head growing up. And so you can see just that mental and physical toughness coming out throughout the series. And there's like every player gets injured. I think George Kittle is the only one who doesn't get injured in this game, in this series, because you had Deebo Samuel, and it's in that Browns game, and they talk about it where it's sometimes like you're already kind of sore, but you don't really think too much of it. But he got like a hit on his bicep, and it must have hit just right, and he's like, I don't feel my arm. And so he goes out of the game because like literally like he can't like hold the ball. He's like lost all of his strength in his one arm, and it turns out to be like a hairline fracture in his left scapula. Like that's significant, and you just don't realize, like, when you're seeing, like, you can see the big collisions sometimes, but sometimes it's just the constant collisions that kind of builds up and causes some of these, like, you would consider them maybe minor, but like they're difficult to recover from. And they were actually talking about that with Amon-Ra Brown's oblique injury, where they had to be very careful with it because if they pushed it a little bit too far, it could all of a sudden become an 8 to 10 week injury. I know for me, just I'm an avid runner. I run a lot, and I strained my hamstring once. And I couldn't walk for like a week, and that gave me just a more profound insight into, and these NFL players are able to like sprint at top speeds with some of these injuries. It's just incredible to me. But then you also, speaking of hamstrings, Justin Jefferson, I actually kind of forgot that this happened, is that he was out for a lot of the games this last year with a hamstring injury. And he was really struggling to come back from that. And it was a contract year, which made it even more difficult because he's trying to prove himself worthy of that bigger contract. So there's just a lot of these finer details that you just don't realize just with like watching the games on Sunday. So I really like having that extra context. And I watch sports shows. I know some of the stuff that's being talked about, but this gets to an even finer level of granularity that I really appreciate. But I think one of the bigger injuries is Davante Adams, and just Davante Adams as a whole. So he had one play, I believe it was against the Chargers, where he hurts it's either his left or right shoulder, and he comes back in the game and he like beasts it, but he's not quite the same after that, and he's really struggling to recover from it. And he was making progress, but then it comes to the game against the Packers. He really wanted to play in that game because it was against his former team. And he talks about there's a hit by a linebacker, and it wasn't even a hard hit. He just gets pushed out of bounds. And he didn't even fall over or anything, just gets pushed out of bounds, but it was right on the shoulder, and immediately the pain flares up, and all of the weeks of rehab that he was just doing just went down the drain because it's right back where it was. So just, it's really interesting to see that even the smallest thing can re-aggravate an injury and just kind of have a major setback, which is really hard from an athlete's perspective to overcome mentally. Like, there's a lot that goes behind that, because when you put a ton of effort in, and they even had like Justin Jefferson's trainer talking about this a little bit, where they kind of have to engage with the player, where they're thinking about like, oh, how did this happen to me? And they kind of have to go through that mental process of going through the injury, and they're missing time, they're letting their team down. And just to see the drive of these players to come back. But when you have that drive and you put in all that effort and then you re-aggravate the injury, like, that's really hard to deal with. So I got a greater appreciation for just how much effort these athletes put in. And this is kind of really making me feel a lot more that I want to see a series of this based on the defensive side of the ball, because they're dealing with all sorts of injuries all the time. Plus, it's not an offensive league, so they're very much undervalued. They're not as much in the public spotlight. You don't know as much about them. And I would say that they probably go underappreciated as opposed to an offensive skill player. So I think it would be really interesting if Netflix ever took that route, like safeties or linebackers. I bet linebackers would be probably the one to focus most on, because they are the field general of the defensive side. So I think you could have some really good episodes if you chose a group of linebackers and followed them throughout the year. The third thing I pulled from this is I got a deeper and more nuanced understanding of wide receivers who complain about not getting the ball enough. I know in the past, I've always had the opinion of, oh my gosh, the receiver's just complaining, and he's making things difficult for the quarterback by just saying, hey, get me the ball. I need my targets. I need mine. But the show kind of lends more insight into this aspect by following Davante Adams, because he does not have... His situation was really interesting, because they were actually detailing that he went over to the Raiders, and this was really widely speculated at the time that he went over to the Raiders because of Derek Carr, and he just comes out and admits that in this show that, hey, he knew his time in Green Bay was over. He knew they weren't going to get to the championship, and he and Derek Carr had been talking for a while, and they really wanted to give one season or multiple seasons together a try to see if they could get themselves to the championship based on the chemistry they had in college. So that is the reason he went over to Las Vegas. But it's really interesting because it didn't quite work out the first season. Like they had a good connection, they put up good stats, but the Raiders only went 6-11, and then the Raiders did not re-sign Derek Carr. He hit free agency and then went over to the Saints. And so where does that leave Davante Adams? He kind of came over to the Raiders for Derek Carr, and now he's just no longer there. And the front office decides to go with Jimmy Garoppolo, who he's a fine quarterback, but he's not a great quarterback. And there starts to be some tension between them because Garoppolo had his foot injury and wasn't able to take part in OTA, so they weren't able to work on their chemistry together. And you can just see they are off. And throughout all of their first, I think 6 games, they don't break 20 points. There's one where they get to 21, but it's because of a safety, so their offense never got above 20 points. And you can just see they showcase through some of the clips how out of sync they are and how Garoppolo made the wrong read or made the wrong throw. And there was one throw, I think it was against the Lions, I think. Davante Adams is wide open, and Jimmy Garoppolo just totally misses him. Now, you will see after some of those plays on the sideline, Davante Adams is mic'd up, and he's kind of complaining. And I think he's getting all mad on the sideline and stuff like that. And that, I think, personally, is detrimental to a team culture that is a bit selfish. But I did gain a little bit more understanding because he is saying he's of the opinion hey, I'm not focused necessarily on the wins and losses. I'm focused on greatness. I want to be great. I want to help this team succeed. And if I'm not contributing, I feel like I'm not pulling my weight. And if we're doing poorly without me getting the ball, because there's several games that they detail where he's just not really getting the passing volume, he's basically saying hey, our offense is terrible as it is. Why are you not even trying to get me the ball? And I think that that's a little bit different than, oh, we're winning, but I'm not getting the catches I think I deserve. I'm not getting the spotlight I deserve. And so I kind of think the media blew his comments out of proportion. I would say there's a bit of a middle ground on it where he is probably acting slightly selfishly, getting mad about it and kind of taking some of it out on his teammates. But I think the frustration is genuine because their offense was so bad and he thought he had a lot to contribute to the offense. And so you can see an example of that where he's not mad when they do win, even though he has a poor stat line. When the first game Antonio Pierce takes over, Antonio Pierce had a very run-focused mindset towards that game. Josh Jacobs got a lot of work. And I think Davante Adams only had 4 catches in the game. But he's hey, I didn't get involved very much, but we won. I'm okay with winning. I'm not going to complain when we're winning. And so I think that while I still don't always agree, and I would probably on a per case basis need to know the context around it, I gained a little bit more sympathy for the receiver not complaining about not getting as much targets. And then the last point I wanted to bring up is just everyday life for an NFL player is a little bit, it's just kind of interesting to kind of see how they go about their daily how about they go about their day. I know that this was really interesting to me in the quarterback series with Kirk Cousins, because he was playing a playoff game, lost it to the New York Giants, and came home and just kind of had to go back into his dad role, put his kids to bed that night. I know if I just lost a playoff game, I would be devastated and just wouldn't be able to be in the mindset to do that. But it was just, you kind of put football, have to leave football where football is, and then you have your family life where your family life is. And I feel like if you were an NFL player, you probably would have to compartmentalize that a little bit, because there is so much stress that comes with the NFL and trying to win in the NFL, and the competition of trying to be the best and always atop the depth chart, secure your position, because if you get injured or you start playing poorly, it's always next man up. We've seen a lot of that happen in the NFL, and I know a lot of examples on the Panthers where that's happened, where there was a promising prospect, but he could just never get on the field. You've always heard the phrase, your best ability is your availability, because if you're never available, you're just not contributing to the team. So a team's gonna not invest in you because they just have to move on if somebody's outperforming. And I would say, like, Trey Lance with Brock Purdy coming in is one of the perfect examples of that. Trey Lance got injured, wasn't his fault, but it was next man up. Brock Purdy came in, he performed, and then the 49ers realized, we got to move on. We've got someone who can run our offense for us, and he's doing it better than Trey Lance. So it's interesting to kind of see how the family life is separate from the NFL life. And I thought it was just kind of funny, too. One of the more funny aspects that stood out to me, scenes, was it was Davante Adams' wife, and she was inviting classmates of her daughter over to a birthday party, and she was talking about, it's like, oh, they didn't know that her dad was Davante Adams. So you see these families coming to like this insane mansion with this extravagant birthday party, and they were probably somewhat clueless that that's where they were going, but it was one of those things like, oh my gosh, her dad's Davante Adams, like a top receiver in the league. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. So those are my thoughts on the first half of the Netflix receiver series. I'm really enjoying it, and I'm looking forward to the second half of the series. And I think it's really deep in my understanding for the receiver skill position, because there's a lot that goes into it that you just don't see on a typical NFL Sunday telecast. Like, as you're watching some of the show, they'll put in commentator clips from like the NFL broadcast, and you kind of see how it fits in and how they have some of that insight, but you don't always put two and two together when you're watching it on any given Sunday. So those are my thoughts on Netflix's receiver series. You should take a watch for yourself and let me know in the comments below what you think of the series.